Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, is there an old paper near you tonight? A letter or a ledger holding some quiet history of its own? Watson learned that ink never quite forgets its age, nor a locked door its secrets. Do subscribe so no record goes unread. Now draw near the lamp, for as Holmes believed, truth, however carefully buried, always leaves its mark. Find us too on Spotify. Link below. Chapter 1. The Master of Vane Court. It was upon a wet morning in November, with the fog lying thick along the Marylebone Road, and the rain streaking our windows in long, grey rivulets, that I first heard the name of Vane Court. I had come down late to breakfast, my old wound aching in the damp as it always did in that season, and found Sherlock Holmes already dressed and standing at the window, his pipe unlit in his hand, watching the street below with the peculiar stillness that in him signified expectation rather than idleness. "You have the look, Watson, of a man who has slept badly and eaten worse," said he, without turning. "You will have opportunity to remedy both, for we have a client at 9:30, and I fancy his business will not be a short one. You have had a telegram? A letter, delivered by hand not 20 minutes ago. A Mr. Percival Stroud, solicitor, writes on behalf of a client whose name he declines to mention, upon a matter he describes as being of the utmost delicacy and urgency." Holmes tossed the note to me across the table. "Observe the hand, Watson. What do you make of it?" I turned the paper over, though I confess I saw little beyond a neat legal script. "A careful man," I ventured. "Methodical. Precise." "Precise, yes, but observe how the precision falters in the final lines, where the ink grows heavier and the letters lean more steeply forward. A man who began this letter in his ordinary professional composure and finished it in considerable agitation. He has also, I think, rewritten the opening paragraph, for the fold of the paper does not correspond to the natural crease one makes in sealing a single continuous sheet. Whatever troubles him, Watson, it is not a client's ordinary anxiety over a disputed boundary or a contested will. It is something nearer to himself. Mr. Percival Stroud arrived punctually, a spare, grey-whiskered man of perhaps 55, dressed with the sober correctness of his profession, and carrying beneath his arm a leather case which he set down beside his chair with unusual care, as though it contained something more fragile than documents. His manner, as he seated himself, was that of a man striving to appear composed, while every line of his face betrayed the opposite. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I come to you on behalf of Sir Alister Vane, of Vane Court in Surrey. I have been his family's solicitor, as my father was before me, for these 30 years, and I may say without exaggeration that I have never known him in a state resembling his present one. Pray be precise, Mr. Stroud. What has occurred?" 3 nights ago, someone attempted to force the lock of the estate record room at Vane Court. The attempt failed, the door being of considerable strength, but Sir Alister discovered scratches about the keyhole the following morning, and has been in a condition of the greatest agitation ever since. "A robbery, then?" I said. "Was anything of value kept there?" Mr. Stroud hesitated, and it was in that hesitation, brief as it was, that I saw Holmes's grey eyes sharpen with interest. "Nothing that could be sold, Doctor. The room contains only the family's legal papers, deeds, settlements, mortgages, correspondence extending back some 4 generations. But there is one document among them which Sir Alister regards as being of extraordinary importance, a lien record, dating from 26 years ago, concerning a debt once charged against a portion of the estate." "A debt 26 years old," said Holmes, leaning back in his chair and joining the tips of his fingers together. "One would suppose so ancient an obligation to have been long since settled or forgotten. Why does Sir Alister fear its destruction now? He has not confided the reason to me, Mr. Holmes, though I have served him faithfully these many years. He says only that should the record be destroyed, the legitimacy of certain claims upon the estate would fall into doubt, and that he intends to make the whole matter public tomorrow evening before the assembled family. Until then, he has sealed the record room and asks that you come at once to Vane Court, both to examine the attempted entry and to remain as his guest until the matter is resolved." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, where he stood a long moment in silence, his back to us. "A household," said he at last, "in which a man announces to his assembled family that he intends, upon the following evening, to reveal a secret which threatens the very foundation of their inheritance, and in which, before that evening arrives, someone attempts to reach into a locked room and destroy the evidence of it. Mr. Stroud, I confess the case interests me considerably more than the ordinary run of stolen documents. We will come down with you this afternoon." Our journey to Surrey was accomplished mostly in silence, Holmes occupying himself with the sodden countryside beyond the carriage window, while Stroud dozed fitfully, or feigned to. It was near 4 o'clock, and the light already failing, when we came at last up the long avenue of elms to Vane Court, a grey, gabled house of considerable age, its windows lit here and there against the gathering dusk, its whole aspect suggesting less a home than an institution governed by rule and observance. We were received in the hall by a manservant of unbending correctness, who informed us that Sir Alistair would see us directly, and it was there, within the first quarter hour, that I began to form my impression of that singular household. Dinner, I learned, was served each evening at the stroke of 7 without variation. The servants moved through the passages with the silent precision of men long drilled to a single master's temper. Even the family, as I observed them gathering by degrees in the drawing-room before dinner, seemed to hold themselves in a kind of practised deference, as though each awaited from one moment to the next some word of approval or rebuke. Sir Alistair Vane himself, when he came down to us, proved a tall, spare man of some 60 years, with iron-grey hair, a face deeply lined by temper rather than age, and an eye that measured each of us in turn with the coldness of a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than loved. He greeted Holmes civilly enough, thanked him for coming, and then, with a bluntness that startled even Stroud, declined to say one word more upon the subject that had brought us there. "You will forgive me, Mr. Holmes," said he, "if I keep my own counsel a little longer. Tomorrow evening, before my whole family, I shall say what must be said, and you may judge afterward whether my caution was excessive. Until then, the record room remains sealed, and I ask only that you observe my household, and tell me whether you find, among those who call themselves my family, any person capable of what was attempted 3 nights past." It was a curious commission, and one that occupied Holmes's attention keenly throughout that long and formal dinner, during which I had ample opportunity to study the faces ranged about the table. There was Julian Vane, the nephew, a handsome, restless young man whose easy charm did not entirely conceal an undercurrent of anxiety. Clara, Sir Alistair's widowed daughter, watchful and pale. Lady Eleanor, the second wife, composed to the point of iciness, and seated somewhat apart the quiet, disciplined figure of Edmund Hale, the estate steward, who spoke scarcely a dozen words the whole evening through. It was not until we had withdrawn and stood together for a moment in the corridor outside my room that Holmes gave voice to the thought that had evidently been forming in him since our arrival. "You have observed, Watson, that every soul in this house wants something of Sir Alistair. Julian wants his inheritance unencumbered. Clara wants his consent to marry. Lady Eleanor wants her peace undisturbed. Hale, I think, wants recognition long withheld. Stroud wants the whole affair concluded without inquiry. But mark this, Watson, for it is the whole riddle in a sentence. Not all of them want money." He said no more, but retired to his room with the air of a man already 3 moves deep into a game whose board he had not yet fully seen, leaving me to my own restless thoughts, and to the strange, oppressive silence of a house awaiting, though it did not yet know it, a tragedy. Chapter 2. The Document Behind the Iron Door. I woke the next morning to find the rain had not relented, and came down to breakfast to learn that Holmes had already been about the house for above an hour, having risen, as Mrs. Fenn the housekeeper informed me with a certain disapproval, before any of the servants themselves were stirring. I found him at last in Sir Alister's private study, crouched before a narrow iron-bound door that stood at the farther end of the room, a lens in his hand, and his coat sleeves already dusted with the grime of old woodwork. "Come in, Watson, and shut the door behind you," said he without looking up. "You find me admiring what I believe to be the most honestly guarded room in the county of Surrey, and consequently the most interesting." The record room, when Sir Alister himself arrived to admit us properly some minutes later, proved a chamber perhaps 12 feet by 8, reached only through the study, and secured by 2 locks of quite different character. An old brass mechanism opened by a key which Sir Alister wore upon his watch chain, and a newer steel lock for which Stroud alone possessed the key, worn, as he showed us, upon a fine chain beneath his coat. "Neither of us may enter without the other," Sir Alister explained, with something almost like satisfaction in his voice. "It has been the custom in this family since my grandfather's day. No single man may tamper with what is kept here." Holmes examined both locks with close attention, remarking upon the scratches about the outer keyhole. "Rough, hurried marks," he pronounced them, "made by an unpractised hand with an implement not properly suited to the purpose," before passing into the room itself. I followed, and found it as cheerless a chamber as I have ever entered. The 2 windows painted shut and thick with the grime of years, the fireplace bricked over so completely that no draught could be felt, and the walls lined floor to ceiling with shelves bearing deeds, mortgages, marriage settlements, and bundles of yellowing correspondence, each tied with faded ribbon and labelled in a succession of hands spanning some 4 generations of vain solicitors. "A room built to keep the past from escaping," Holmes murmured, running his finger along a shelf and holding it up, unmarked to the light. "And dusted with more regularity than most drawing-rooms, I observe. Someone tends this chamber with care, Sir Alister, though you tell me it is seldom entered." "Hale sees to it," said our host shortly. "It is his charge, among others." In the far corner stood a locked cabinet of dark oak, and it was here, Sir Alister told us, that the Lien record itself was kept, within a portfolio of red leather set apart from the ordinary files. He would not open the cabinet for us, though Holmes asked it plainly, saying only that its contents would be revealed to the whole family on the following evening, and not before. "I will tell you this much, Mr. Holmes, since you will learn it in any case tomorrow," said Sir Alister, standing very straight beside the cold hearth. "The lien was registered 26 years ago, when my elder brother Frederick borrowed heavily against a portion of this estate. The debt was believed discharged before his death, but the release document confirming that discharge has never been found. If the lien remains, in law, still active, a portion of Vane Court might yet pass from this family to an outside claimant." "And your nephew Julian," said Holmes quietly, "stands to lose most by such a discovery, since he is, I collect, your presumptive heir." Sir Alister's mouth tightened. "You collect a great deal, Mr. Holmes, in a very short visit." He said no more upon the subject, and led us from the room, locking both doors behind him with a deliberateness that struck me as almost ceremonial. That evening's dinner I shall not soon forget, for I have rarely witnessed a man use the courtesies of the table as instruments of such deliberate cruelty. Sir Alister, presiding at the head of that long board beneath the candlelight, turned first upon Julian, remarking before the whole family that a man who could not govern his own accounts had small claim to govern an estate, and that wastefulness was a vice no inheritance could cure. Julian coloured deeply and said nothing, though his knuckles whitened about his glass. To Clara, seated pale and upright beside her stepmother, Sir Alister observed, with a coldness that seemed to still the very air of the room, that her marriage would receive no blessing from him until certain questions of birth and name, as he termed them, had been settled beyond all doubt, a remark that caused her to set down her fork and fix her eyes upon her plate for the remainder of the meal. And to Lady Eleanor herself, who had said scarcely a word throughout, he remarked, with a thin and joyless smile, that affection was a pleasant thing, but that it altered the law not one particle. The silence that followed these several thrusts was of a peculiar and terrible quality, broken only by the small sounds of cutlery and the drumming of rain against the shuttered windows. I glanced at Holmes and found him watching, not Sir Alistair, but the faces of those who suffered him, studying, as a naturalist studies the reactions of some sensitive organism to a series of calculated irritants, the shame in Julian's eyes, the fear in Clara's, the icy control with which Lady Eleanor mastered her own countenance. It was near 10 o'clock, as we sat afterward in the small library set aside for our use, that a servant brought word of a change in the household's arrangements for the morrow. Sir Alistair, it seemed, had cancelled his customary morning ride, and would instead meet Mr. Stroud in the record room at 9 o'clock precisely. Miss Lorne, Lady Eleanor's secretary, had been instructed to hold herself ready to prepare a number of letters for the family immediately thereafter. "A meeting, and then letters," said Holmes when the servant had withdrawn. "He means to settle the matter first with his solicitor in private, before declaring it to the world at large. A cautious order of proceeding, Watson, and yet observe." He paused, tapping the ash from his pipe with unhurried precision. "The news has been carried through this house within the hour, and I have marked, in every face that received it, not the smallest flicker of curiosity, only dread. Now that, my dear fellow, is a very singular thing to find in a household that does not yet know what is to be announced." He said no more that night, but I observed that he did not go early to his bed, and that the light beneath his door burned long after the rest of the house had settled into that uneasy silence, which precedes, though none of us then knew it, catastrophe. Chapter 3. Death Before 9. I have known, in the course of my long association with Sherlock Holmes, a good many mornings that began in ordinary quiet and ended in horror, but few so abruptly as that one. I had risen a little before 8. The rain at last diminished to a fine mist upon the lawns, and had gone down expecting nothing more remarkable than the cold ham and silent civility that had characterized every breakfast since our arrival. Instead, I found the hall in a state of suppressed agitation, Mrs. Fenn wringing her hands upon the stair, and a footman dispatched at a run for Edmund Hale. "Sir Alistair has not come down, sir," the housekeeper told me, "and his door is locked from within, and he does not answer to any knocking, though we have tried these 10 minutes past." I found Holmes already upon the landing when I reached the study door, fully dressed, though it was scarcely 8, and listening with his ear near the panel with an intentness that told me he did not share the household's easy hope of a master merely overslept. Hale arrived a moment later, grim and composed even in that extremity, and it was he, with Julian's assistance, who set his shoulder to the door and forced the lock at last with a splintering crack that seemed to echo through the whole house. The sight that met us I shall not soon forget. Sir Alistair Vane lay upon the floor beside his writing desk, one arm flung out before him, his head resting in a dark stain that had already begun to dry upon the carpet. A single blow, delivered with great force, had crushed the temple, and lying near his outflung hand, its bright surface dulled by what it had done, was a bronze paperweight, fashioned in the shape of a couchant lion, an ornament I had myself remarked upon the desk not 2 evenings before. Beyond him, the inner door to the record room stood open, a fact which struck me, even in that first moment of shock, as wrong, for I had seen Sir Alistair himself turn both keys in its lock scarce 12 hours earlier. Holmes was through that door in an instant, and I heard him give a short, sharp exclamation that brought me after him. The oaken cabinet stood open, its lock forced or turned by some hand possessing the means to do so. The red leather portfolio was gone from its place, and in a shallow tray of pierced metal set upon the lower shelf, used, I collect, for the burning of superseded papers, lay a heap of blackened fragments, curled and brittle, from which no more than the ash of what had been a document could now be recovered. "The Lien record," said Holmes quietly, "or what someone wishes us to believe was the Lien record. Touch nothing, Watson, until I have seen the whole of this room as it stands." He was some 20 minutes about that examination, moving from window to hearth to door with the silent thoroughness I had seen him bring to 100 such scenes, while below us the house filled with the sounds of arriving authority, for someone, in the confusion, had already sent to the village, and it was not an hour later that Inspector Bradstreet arrived from London, having been summoned, as I later learned, by a telegram Stroud had caused to be sent the previous evening, in anticipation, he said, of trouble. The circumstances, as Bradstreet set them down in his notebook, seemed at first to admit of no great mystery. The study windows were latched upon the inside, and showed, moreover, the same undisturbed grime that rendered them all but immovable. A footman stationed in the corridor outside, in accordance with Sir Alister's own instruction following the earlier attempt upon the record room, swore that he had watched that passage without interruption from 7:30, and had seen no one pass either in or out. Both keys to the record room's second lock were moreover fully accounted for. Sir Alister's own was found still within his waistcoat pocket, and Stroud, when the question was put to him, drew his own key forth from the fine chain about his neck without the smallest hesitation. "A sealed room, Mr. Holmes," said Bradstreet, not without a certain satisfaction in the phrase, "and but one door left open by the man who died there. I think we need not look very far for our murderer, sir, when we have a nephew heavily in debt, disinherited in all but name by a threatened disclosure, who quarrelled bitterly with the dead man not 4 hours before he died. For it had come out within that first terrible hour that Julian Vane had gone to his uncle's study near midnight, and that voices raised in anger had been heard by more than one servant through the passage door. Julian himself, white and shaking, did not deny it. "We quarrelled, yes," said he when Bradstreet pressed him. "He told me I should have nothing but what I earned by better conduct than I had yet shown. I left him living, Inspector, upon my honour, and went straight to my room." Holmes said little through all of this, but I observed him watching, not the plain and damning facts that Bradstreet was assembling with such evident relish, but the faces of those who moved about that stricken house. Julian's fear was plain enough, and plain too was something short of grief, a shock that seemed, to my professional eye, more nearly akin to horror at his own position than to sorrow for his uncle. Clara, when told the news, asked first, in a voice scarcely her own, whether any of the letters her father had intended had been completed before his death, a question that struck me then as strange beyond all reason. Lady Eleanor's first thought was for the servants, whom she forbade, with icy composure, from speaking to any person from the newspapers. Stroud, arriving breathless from the village, went first to the record room and stood long over the ashes in the tray before he had so much as glanced toward the body of the man he had served for 30 years, and Miss Lorne, pale and quiet in the doorway, asked only, in a small voice that none but Holmes appeared to hear, whether the study clock had stopped. It was that evening, as we walked a little apart from the house in the last grey light, that Holmes gave voice at last to the thought that had plainly been forming in him through all the confusion of that dreadful day. "You have attended a good many deathbeds in your time, Watson, and you know, as I do, the particular quality of grief when it is genuine. What I have observed today in that house is not grief, in the main, nor even fear in its simplest form. It is expectation, Watson, the reaction of people who have long foreseen some blow, and who find, now that it has fallen in a shape they did not quite anticipate. Grief, I have found, may be imitated tolerably well by a clever performer. Expectation is a far harder thing to counterfeit, and I saw it plainly enough today upon more than one face in that dining-room." He would say no more, but I marked that he did not that night share Bradstreet's evident conviction that the case was already as good as closed. Chapter 4. The Missing Hour. The day following Sir Alister's death was given over largely to the establishment of that orderly record of movements, without which, as Holmes has often remarked to me, no investigation can properly proceed. Bradstreet, to his credit, went about the business with commendable thoroughness, and by the middle of the afternoon had assembled from the various members of the household an account which seemed, upon its face, to leave very little in doubt. Sir Alister, it appeared, had retired to his study at 10:30, following a brief and stiff exchange with his family in the drawing-room. Julian had gone to him at 11, and had left, by his own admission and that of the footman, in the passage, some 20 minutes later, in evident anger. Miss Lorne had carried in a quantity of correspondence at 11:15, and had remained, she said, no more than 5 minutes. Stroud claimed to have sat alone in the library until midnight, engaged, he said, in reviewing certain papers in preparation for the morning's meeting. Clara and Captain Vale, who had called that evening and been persuaded to stay rather later than propriety generally allowed, had talked together in the conservatory until 20 minutes to 12. Lady Eleanor had retired, by her own account and that of Miss Lorne, who had attended her at 10 o'clock precisely, and had not left her room again. A very tidy sequence, Holmes observed, when Bradstreet had laid the whole of it before us that evening in the small library, and one which places our friend Julian very conveniently as the last person, save the murderer himself, to have seen Sir Alister alive. "Not the last, Mr. Holmes," said Bradstreet with the air of a man producing his best card. "A housemaid, going up to bed shortly after midnight, heard the study clock strike the hour quite plainly through the door, and another, sleeping in the room above, heard what she took to be Sir Alister moving furniture some little while after. We place the death, therefore, between midnight and 1. "Do you indeed?" said Holmes, and something in his tone caused me to look up sharply, though Bradstreet, absorbed in his notebook, did not remark it. It was in the study itself to which Holmes returned again and again through that long day with a patience that tried even Bradstreet's forbearance, that the first threads of doubt began, for me at least, to show themselves. The clock upon the mantel, a handsome instrument of ormolu and marble which Sir Alister had been known, throughout the county, to regard with an almost superstitious exactitude, Holmes found, upon careful comparison with his own watch, and with the clock in the hall below, to be running 7 minutes slow. "A trifling matter, you will say," said he, holding his watch beside the mantel clock's face for my inspection, "and so it would be, in any ordinary household. But you heard Stroud himself remark, not 2 days since, that Sir Alister once dismissed a footman for permitting the very same clock to run 3 minutes wrong, and that he wound and regulated it each Sunday with his own hand. A man of such particular habit does not suffer his clock to drift 7 minutes without correction, unless someone has very recently altered it, and for a purpose." Upon the desk itself, half hidden beneath a blotter, Holmes discovered a small memorandum in Sir Alister's own hand, setting down his intention to ride at 8 o'clock the following morning, an intention which had plainly at some point been altered, for the figure had been struck through, and 6:30 written above it in the same hand, or a passable imitation of it. "And yet," said Holmes, drawing back the curtain to show me the sodden lawn beyond, still glistening from the night's rain, "no man rides at 6:30 across ground, already soaked by a downpour that had scarcely ceased when this alteration was made. The change serves no purpose I can discern, save to suggest that Sir Alister himself was occupied with the ordinary business of the morrow at some hour after the change was written, which is to say, alive and unremarkable in his habits, later than we have yet supposed." More curious still was a sealed envelope, addressed in Sir Alister's hand to Mr. Percival Stroud, which lay upon the corner of the desk nearest the door. Bradstreet, upon opening it in our presence, found within nothing but a single sheet of blank paper. "A blind, Watson," said Holmes, turning the empty envelope over beneath his lens, prepared, I think, to suggest that Sir Alister sat here composing a communication to his solicitor at some hour convenient to whoever wishes us to believe in it. Observe the seal, Inspector, before you set it aside." Bradstreet held it to the light, and I saw, as Holmes had plainly seen already, a small crescent of red sealing wax adhering to the underside of the envelope's flap, its edge sharp and unblurred, as though it had been pressed there and lifted away again rather than melted and set in the ordinary course of sealing a letter. "The same wax," said Holmes, crossing now to the bronze lion where it still lay, marked with chalk upon the carpet, "as this." He indicated with the tip of his pencil a faint crescent of red adhering to the base of the paperweight itself, overlooked, I think, in the horror of that first discovery, and only now, in the calmer light of the following evening, brought clearly into view. "The weapon has been wiped, Inspector, wiped with some care, for there is not a fingerprint to be found upon its whole surface. Yet whoever wiped it did not think to examine its base, where it had evidently rested at some time before the murder, upon a surface bearing wet sealing wax. I think we may take it that this envelope and this paperweight occupied the same corner of the desk within a very short time of one another. It was in the ashes of the burned document, however, that Holmes made the discovery which seemed to trouble him most. Sifting the fragile black fragments with a delicacy I could not have commanded myself, he drew forth several pieces bearing quite unmistakably the fine, regular ruling of a modern, machine-made ledger paper. Stroud himself has told us, said Holmes, that the original Lien record was written upon thick parchment of considerable age, ruled, if ruled at all, by hand. This, he held the blackened fragment to the lamp, is nothing of the kind. Someone has burned a paper here, Watson, but I begin to doubt very much that it was the paper Sir Alistair meant us to see. Against these doubts, however, stood one piece of evidence that Bradstreet not unreasonably regarded as conclusive. Beneath the record-room cabinet, in a corner not easily seen without stooping, a cuff-link of plain gold, engraved with the initials J.V., had been found that afternoon, and a housemaid, questioned closely, now recalled, or believed she recalled, having glimpsed Julian himself near the study door some little while after midnight. "It weighs heavily against him, Mr. Holmes, you must allow that," said Bradstreet, not without a note of triumph. "It weighs, certainly," Holmes replied, turning the little cuff-link over in his fingers, with an expression I had learned to associate with his deepest scepticism. "But consider, Inspector, what manner of murderer we are asked to imagine. A man cool enough to alter a clock, forge a change of riding hour, prepare a false letter sealed in advance, and burn a substituted document in place of the true one, and yet careless enough to shed, in the course of all this elaborate contrivance, so personal and so damning an object as a cuff-link bearing his own initials, directly beneath the very cabinet he had come to rob. It is not impossible, Watson, but I confess it strikes me as a very curious sort of carelessness in so careful a criminal." Chapter 5. Agreements without signatures. Holmes announced, upon the third morning of our stay at Vane Court, that he intended to interview each member of the household separately, and I confess I looked forward to the exercise with some relief, for the atmosphere of that stricken house had grown, by then, well nigh unbearable, a silence broken only by the whispered consultations of servants and the occasional sound, from some upstairs room, of a woman weeping behind a closed door. We began with Julian, who received us in the billiard-room, a chamber which seemed, in its faded gaiety, peculiarly ill-suited to the gravity of our purpose. He had recovered something of his composure since the discovery of the body, though his eyes were red-rimmed and his hand, as he set down his cue, was not entirely steady. "You will wish to hear of the quarrel," said he, before Holmes had asked a single question. "I have told the inspector already, and I will tell you the same. My uncle offered that night to clear the whole of my debts, every farthing of them, Mr. Holmes, upon a single condition, that I sign away my claim to Vane Court in favour of Clara's boy." "And you refused," said Holmes. "I refused, though God knows I have little enough love for this house or its acres. It was not the money I would not surrender, Mr. Holmes, nor even the property. It was the manner of the thing. To be disinherited publicly, before the family, as though I were a servant dismissed for pilfering the plate, that I could not stomach, whatever the arithmetic of the matter." Holmes regarded him a long moment. "You would rather owe your creditors a fortune than owe your uncle your gratitude. Is that the substance of it?" "You may put it so if you like," said Julian, with a flash of his old defiance. "I did not kill him for it, Mr. Holmes. I left him living and angry, and I have paid for that quarrel every hour since." Clara Vane we found in the small morning-room that overlooked the rose garden, her hands occupied, with a determined steadiness that did not deceive me for a moment, in some piece of needlework she had plainly abandoned and resumed a dozen times that morning. She spoke, when pressed, with evident reluctance of her father's long opposition to her marriage. "He would not consent to Marcus," said she, "though Marcus has loved me faithfully these 2 years past, because Marcus had learned something, I do not know precisely what, concerning my late husband. My father used it as a lever against me, Mr. Holmes, as he used everything as a lever against everyone in this house. I feared, if the old records were examined too closely, that questions might be raised touching my son's own name and place in the world. That is the whole of my secret, if secret it may be called, and I am not ashamed to own it, though I would have died rather than see it discussed before the servants. Captain Vale, whom we found awaiting his turn in the hall with the patient discomfort of a man unused to being under suspicion, confirmed the substance of her account, and added, with a bluntness I rather admired, that he had himself urged Sir Alistair upon more than one occasion to settle the whole question privately, rather than permit it to fester as a public grievance. I loved her regardless of what her father chose to give or withhold, said he, but I will not pretend I did not press him to be done with it. A man grows weary of waiting upon another man's temper for the right to marry. It was Lady Eleanor, however, who gave us, I think, the clearest window yet into the peculiar solidarity of that household. She received us in her own sitting-room, composed as ever, though I observed that her hands, folded in her lap, were never quite still. "You will have gathered, Mr. Holmes, that this is not a family given to confidences," said she. "We have practised silence a long while, and practised it, I dare say, rather better than we have practised affection. I will tell you this much. Some 10 days before my husband died, I persuaded several members of this household, Hale among them, and Miss Lorne, to say nothing of an incident in which my husband accused Mr. Stroud before witnesses of having mishandled some old legal paper. I did not then know what paper he meant. I knew only that a public accusation against our own solicitor would have brought upon this family precisely the sort of scrutiny I have spent 20 years attempting to avoid. Edmund Hale, when at last we came to him in the small spare room off the estate office that served him as both study and refuge, proved as ever the most difficult to draw out. He answered our questions with the steward's careful economy, volunteering nothing, until Holmes, with a directness I had seldom seen him employ so early in an interview, asked him plainly what he understood Sir Alistair to have intended dismissing Stroud for. "I did not say he intended to dismiss him, Mr. Holmes," said Hale after a pause. "You did not need to say it," Holmes replied. "You have referred 3 times in the course of this conversation to what Sir Alistair intended after his meeting with Stroud, and each time your voice has fallen, as a man's voice falls when he speaks of a thing he expects but does not welcome. What passed between them, Hale, that you overheard some days since in the passage?" Hale's composure did not break, but something in his eyes shifted, as a man's eyes shift who has been carrying a weight a long while alone. "I heard them raise their voices, sir, over what my master called a debt that was never truly paid. I do not know what he meant by it. I have served this family 25 years, Mr. Holmes, and I have learned in that time not to ask questions whose answers are not offered to me. It was Miss Lorne, last of all, who supplied the phrase that Holmes, I think, had been waiting the whole day to hear. A quiet, watchful young woman, evidently devoted to Lady Eleanor's comfort beyond the strict requirements of her position, she confirmed, without hesitation, that an understanding had existed among the household, unspoken, she was careful to say, rather than agreed in so many words, that whatever Sir Alistair intended to announce, none among them would permit the servants, still less the newspapers, to learn of it before the family itself had determined how the matter should be met. "We are not conspirators, Mr. Holmes," said she, with a directness that I thought did her credit. "We are merely people who have learned, in this house, that dignity is a fragile thing, and that it is more easily lost than regained." When at last we had done, and sat alone together over a late supper in the small library, Holmes was silent a long while, turning his glass slowly between his fingers. "You will have observed, Watson, that nearly every soul in this house has withheld something from us, and yet I do not think we have uncovered, in the whole of it, a single conspiracy for profit. What we have found, rather, is a kind of collective defence, a household long practised in closing ranks about whatever threatens its outward face, whether that threat be debt, or scandal, or simple shame. It is a very natural instinct, Watson, and a very dangerous one to investigate, for it produces exactly the appearance of universal guilt, while concealing perhaps the presence of one guilt in particular. Chapter 6. The Name in the Margin. We left Vane Court early the following morning, to Bradstreet's evident irritation, for Holmes had announced our intention of driving into the county town to examine the registry office, and had declined, with a courtesy that did not entirely mask his impatience, to explain what he hoped to find there. "You will forgive me, Inspector, if I follow my own methods a little longer before I lay them open to yours," said he, as we climbed into the trap. "I have no wish to send you chasing a fox that may prove, upon closer acquaintance, to be nothing more than a shadow of my own making." The registry office proved a cramped, dusty chamber presided over by an elderly clerk who seemed to regard the intrusion of two strangers upon his ledgers as a species of personal affront, softened only by the half-sovereign Holmes laid with quiet tact upon his desk. It took the better part of an hour, and no small application of Holmes's patience, before the duplicate abstract we sought was found, folded within a bundle of similar documents that had plainly not been disturbed in a great many years. "Here it is, Watson," said Holmes at last, smoothing the brittle paper upon the clerk's own table, "and here, I think, is the first crack in the story we have been told." I bent over the page and saw, in a clerk's careful copper plate now faded to the colour of weak tea, that the lien in question had not, as we had been led to suppose, been charged against the whole of the Vane estate, but against a single small parcel of land known as Greyfield Farm. The creditor was named as one Thomas Hale, and in the margin, in a hand different from the body of the entry, someone had written, in words grown faint but still legible, the phrase maintenance and guardianship. "Thomas Hale," I repeated, "surely—" "The late father of our steward, Edmund Hale," said Holmes, "unless the coincidence of name is a very remarkable one indeed, which I do not for a moment believe. And observe the marginal note, Watson. A debt secured for maintenance and guardianship is no ordinary commercial transaction. Men do not usually borrow money against their estates to be repaid for the guardianship of a horse, or a house, or a parcel of timber. They borrow it, or lend it, upon such terms, in connection with the guardianship of a person." We drove that same afternoon to the parish church some 3 miles distant, where the old rector, a mild and courteous man well past 70, permitted us, upon Holmes's request and a brief explanation touching the Vaughan family's legal affairs, to examine the baptismal register for the year of Edmund Hale's birth. Holmes turned the heavy pages with a care that seemed almost reverent, until he came at last to the entry we sought, and I heard him give a low exclamation of satisfaction that told me he had found what he had come for. Edmund Hale, the register showed, had been born within a few months of the death of Frederick Vane's wife, a fact which, taken alone, might have signified nothing whatever. But it was the entry itself that drew Holmes's closest attention, for though it named Thomas Hale plainly enough as the father, the ink in which that name was written differed, under the strong light Holmes turned upon it, quite perceptibly from the ink of the entries immediately before and after, and the hand, though a tolerable imitation of the rector's predecessor's script, showed, upon close examination, a slight unsteadiness in the formation of certain letters that betrayed to my companion's practised eye a later and more deliberate composition. "This entry has been altered, Watson, and altered some years after it was first set down," said Holmes, straightening at last from his long scrutiny. "Someone has gone to considerable trouble to establish beyond the reach of ordinary inquiry that Edmund Hale was the son of Thomas Hale and no other. I begin to suspect, my dear fellow, that the truth ran rather differently." It was the rector himself consulted upon the point who supplied the final thread, recalling, after some reflection, that the parish register had indeed been examined some 25 years before by a solicitor from the county town, a Mr. Stroud, he believed the name had been, though he could not now be certain whether it was the father or the son who had come upon that occasion. We returned to Vane Court in a silence which I did not care to break, for I could see that Holmes's thoughts had travelled a considerable distance ahead of my own, and it was not until we found Edmund Hale alone in the estate office, going through the dry business of the farm accounts with a composure I now saw for what it was, a discipline maintained at very great cost, that Holmes put to him, gently but without evasion, the question that had brought us so far that day. "Mr. Hale," said he, "did Sir Alister ever ask you whether you had cause to question your own parentage? I've seldom seen a man's self-command tested so severely, nor maintained, in the end, so nearly intact." Hale set down his pen with great deliberation before he answered. "He asked me that question, Mr. Holmes, not 4 days before he died. I told him I had never had cause to doubt that Thomas Hale was my father, and I told him the truth as I then believed it. I don't know what has brought you to ask it of me now, and I will not pretend the asking does not disturb me." Holmes did not press him further, though I saw, in the steward's white knuckles upon the edge of his desk, that the question had shaken him a good deal more than his words allowed. It was that evening, going through the small quantity of Sir Alister's private correspondence which Bradstreet had permitted him to examine, that Holmes found the second piece of the puzzle he had been assembling, a single sheet, evidently a draft never sent, in which Sir Alister had begun and abandoned some formal announcement to be made, as the wording suggested, before the assembled family. The sentence that caught Holmes's eye, and which he read aloud to me in a voice unusually grave, described one person in that household as the only individual beneath that roof possessing a claim untainted by indulgence or deceit. "He means Hale," I said, the conclusion seeming to me, in that moment, unanswerable. "Holmes, surely this settles the matter. If Edmund Hale is in truth the son of Frederick Vane, and Sir Alister meant to proclaim him the rightful heir to a portion of this estate, then Julian had motive enough, and to spare, for silencing his uncle before that revelation could be made." Holmes regarded me for a long moment with an expression I could not quite read. Not disagreement precisely, but a kind of patient reservation, as though he weighed a theory that fitted the visible facts a shade too neatly to satisfy him entirely. "It is a very natural conclusion, Watson, and I do not say it is a wrong one," said he at last. "But you assume in reaching it that every soul in this affair is governed at the last by the single motive of ownership, that Julian would kill to keep what he might otherwise lose, as neatly as a ledger balances a debit against a credit. I have found, in a long experience of human folly, that men commit murder for reasons a good deal stranger and a good deal less tidy than the mere defence of property. We have found the name in the margin, Watson. We have not yet found the hand that wrote it there. Chapter 7. The Creditor's Heir. Inspector Bradstreet met us upon our return with the particular brightness of a man who believes his case, already strong, has just been rendered unanswerable. He informed us, made a further examination of the ashes in the record room, and had discovered, caught beneath the rim of the metal tray where it had evidently fallen unburned, a surviving corner of the document itself, scorched at its edges but legible enough to be read. He laid it before us upon the study table with an air of quiet triumph. I bent to examine it, and made out, in a hand of evident age and formality, the fragment of a phrase, "Thomas Hale and his lawful heirs." "There, Mr. Holmes," said Bradstreet, "that settles the character of the document beyond dispute. Whatever else remains obscure, and it settles, I think, a good deal more besides." Stroud, summoned to confirm the significance of the find, examined the fragment with hands that trembled very slightly, though whether from grief or some other emotion I could not then have said, and pronounced it consistent in its language, with a lien framed to secure the interests of an heir rather than an ordinary creditor. "If this lien remained legally active," said he, "Edmund Hale might claim Greyfield Farm outright, and might, upon proof of his true parentage, challenge the whole settlement of the estate besides. I do not say he would prevail, Mr. Holmes, but he would have grounds to try, and the mere attempt would drag this family's affairs through every newspaper in the county." It was within the hour that a search of Julian's room, conducted by Bradstreet's own hand, produced what he plainly regarded as the final proof of his theory, a single sheet of paper, unsigned, upon which was written, in a hand Julian did not deny to be his own, a demand that Sir Alistair destroy the record, or that the family name should fall with it. Julian, confronted with the note, went very pale but did not attempt to deny its authorship. I wrote it, yes, in a black temper, the night after he first spoke of disinheriting me, said he. But I never delivered it, Mr. Holmes. I tore it across and threw it in the grate, or believed I had. I do not know how it came to be found whole in my own drawer. His protest availed him nothing. Between the note, the cuff-link, the quarrel, and the burned fragment naming the very inheritance he stood to lose, Bradstreet declared himself satisfied beyond further doubt, and within the half-hour Julian Vane had been formally placed under arrest and led away, white and silent, to await conveyance to the county jail. The household's reception of this news, I confess, struck me as scarcely less instructive than the arrest itself. Lady Eleanor, when told, permitted herself something very near relief, remarking only that she had feared, these 3 days past, a truth a great deal harder to bear than a nephew's disgrace. Clara wept, but I thought her tears sprang less from sorrow at her cousin's plight than from a shame she could not fully name, even to herself. Stroud pressed most earnestly that the arrest be conducted with the least possible publicity, and went so far as to suggest, with a solicitor's habitual caution, that the local paper might be persuaded to hold back its account until after the funeral. Edmund Hale, when I encountered him in the passage, asked me only in a low voice whether Julian must be tried publicly, or whether some quieter resolution might yet be found, a question that seemed to me, even then, oddly gentle for a man who stood, by every appearance, to gain an estate through his rival's downfall. Holmes, meanwhile, had returned to the burned fragment with the same close, patient attention he had earlier given to the clock and the sealing wax, and it was that evening, as we sat once more over the ashes of the day's business, that he called my notice to a detail which had escaped me entirely. "Look here, Watson, and tell me what you observe of the ink." He held the scorched fragment beneath the lamp, and I bent close, though I confess I could distinguish little beyond the plain fact of old, brown, black lettering common enough to any document of some age. "I see nothing remarkable," I admitted. "Then look again, and compare it with this." He drew from his pocket-book a small scrap of the original registry abstract we had examined that morning, its ink faded to the uniform brown of true age. The registry entry, Watson, 26 years old, has settled into that flat brownish hue which ink of such an age invariably assumes, the iron gall having long since completed its slow work upon the paper. This fragment, found among the ashes of a document supposedly of the same age, retains, along the edge least touched by the fire, a faint undertone of blue, the colour of ink not yet a 12-month-old, Watson, whatever pains have been taken to disguise it beneath a show of antiquity. I stared at him. "Then the fragment is a forgery." "I believe it to be so, and a recent one," said Holmes. "And I am the more inclined to that belief, Watson, when I recall that this fragment was not found during Bradstreet's first, most thorough examination of the ashes, conducted upon the very morning of the murder, but only after Stroud had been permitted this afternoon a few minutes alone within the record-room, upon the pretext of identifying the document cabinet for the inspector's benefit. You suspect Stroud of planting it. I suspect a great many things, and prove very few of them as yet. But consider the case as it now stands, Watson, and tell me whether it satisfies you as it satisfies Bradstreet. We are asked to believe that Julian Vane, a young man of no great subtlety by his own admission, contrived to enter a sealed record-room without disturbing either lock, altered a clock, forged a change of riding hour, prepared a false letter sealed in advance with the wax taken from the very weapon he meant to use, substituted a modern document for an ancient one, and burned it with sufficient skill to leave behind only so much as would confirm his own guilt, and yet left, in the course of all this elaborate contrivance, both a cuff-link bearing his initials and a written threat he claims to have destroyed. It is not merely careless, Watson. It is too complete. Guilt, in my experience, seldom arranges itself so conveniently for the prosecution. Then why would he destroy the record at all, if not to save himself? That, my dear fellow, is precisely the question that undoes the whole comfortable theory, said Holmes, setting down the fragment at last. Consider it plainly. If Julian believed the lien to be a genuine and damning threat to his inheritance, his soundest course was not to burn it, but to steal it away entire, and hold it, perhaps, against some future need, or simply to destroy it so thoroughly that no fragment, forged or otherwise, could ever be found to trouble him again. A man clever enough to stage so elaborate a deception would scarcely leave behind the very ashes that now condemn him. No, Watson. Someone in this house wished us to find exactly what we have found, in exactly the order we have found it. I mean to learn who, before Bradstreet's tidy case, carries an innocent man to the gallows. Chapter 8. A Household. Afraid of the truth, Holmes spent the better part of the following morning shut up alone in the small library, surrounded by the sheaf of notes he had accumulated through 4 days of observation, and I did not disturb him, having learned long since that such silences, however trying to my own patience, generally preceded some considerable advance in his reasoning. It was not until the middle of the afternoon that he called me to him, and laid before me, with the deliberate care of a man setting out the pieces of a chess problem, the whole shape of the theory he had by then constructed. I do not think, Watson, that Sir Alister meant merely to announce the discovery of an old unpaid debt, said he. I think he meant to announce something a great deal more consequential, that Edmund Hale is the natural son of his elder brother Frederick, and therefore his own nephew by blood, though not, of course, in a position to inherit either the title or the estate entire. He meant, I believe, to recognise Hale publicly, and to settle upon him, by the transfer of Greyfield Farm and perhaps a further portion of the property, the inheritance that his true parentage had always, in justice if not in law, entitled him to expect. A generous impulse for so hard a man, I observed. Sir Alister was not, I think, a man given to generosity for its own sake, Holmes replied. But he was, by every account we have gathered, a man of rigid and unbending principle, who valued the strict letter of obligation above every softer consideration. Having discovered, or perhaps having always known and only now resolved to act upon, the truth of his brother's old debt to Thomas Hale, he determined to discharge it, whatever the cost to the comfort of his household. It is precisely the sort of severe justice such a man delights in dispensing, Watson, the more so when it costs him nothing himself, and a great deal to those about him. He rose and began to pace the narrow confines of the library, ticking off upon his fingers, as was his habit when a chain of reasoning had grown sufficiently clear in his own mind, the consequences that such a revelation must have carried for each member of that troubled household. Consider what this disclosure would have meant to each of them, Watson. Julian would have found himself, at a single stroke, diminished before the whole county, not merely poorer, but publicly proved the lesser man, displaced in his uncle's regard by a servant's son. Clara's fear ran deeper still, for a public examination of the old records must inevitably have invited questions touching her own son's legitimacy, questions she has spent years labouring to keep buried. Lady Eleanor, who has built her whole existence about the maintenance of this family's outward dignity, would have presided over the collapse of that dignity before her own eyes. Hale himself would have been dragged from a life of quiet, honourable obscurity into a glare he never sought, and does not, I think, welcome even now. And Stroud— Holmes paused a moment, and I saw a keener light come into his eye. Stroud stood to lose the most terrible thing a man of his profession can lose, the belief of the world and very possibly of the law that his own father had served this family honestly. You mean that the elder Stroud falsified the parish register? I mean precisely that, Watson, and I think our friend the solicitor has known it or feared it, a great while. Consider his conduct at every turn, his uneasiness whenever the old records were mentioned, even before the murder, his going first to the ashes and only afterward to the body of the man who had employed him 30 years, his insistence at every stage that this whole affair be understood as a dispute over money rather than over parentage, though he himself stands to inherit not one penny of the estate whatever its disposition. A man does not labour so hard to keep a purely financial matter, dressed in financial clothing, unless he fears what lies beneath the disguise. I thought of Edmund Hale, of his stubborn refusal to claim so much as a suspicion of his own true birth, and I put the thought to Holmes directly. Yet, if Hale stands to gain an estate, why does he show no eagerness for it? I have seen the man myself, Holmes, and I would swear his distress is genuine. It is entirely genuine, and it is the plainest evidence we possess that greed is not the engine of this tragedy, said Holmes. Hale begged me, not 2 hours since, to let the whole matter of his parentage lie undisturbed, saying that he had lived 25 years content in the belief that Thomas Hale was his father, and would rather remain the steward he has always been than become, at this late hour, a gentleman he does not know how to be. Clara similarly shows no anger that Hale might gain property that would otherwise pass in some measure to her own son. Her terror is not of losing an inheritance, Watson, but of being examined, of having the whole quiet fabric of her respectability picked apart before an audience she cannot control. And Lady Eleanor cares less, I think, for the division of the estate than for the collapse of the name itself, the loss of that composed, unblemished surface she has spent a marriage constructing. And Stroud remains the strongest case of all. Stroud remains the strongest case of all, Holmes agreed, precisely because his fear is disproportionate to any interest he could rationally be said to hold in the estate's disposition. A man who inherits nothing should mourn nothing by an inheritance rightly settled, unless the settling of it threatens to expose not the Vane family's history but his own. He turned then to the second matter that had occupied him through that long morning, the true hour of Sir Alister's death. The midnight noises, Watson, upon which Bradstreet has built so much of his timetable, I now believe to have been deliberately staged. The clock's slowness, the moved furniture, the whole appearance of a man alive and occupied past midnight. These were contrived, I think, by someone who required the death to appear later than it in truth occurred. I believe Sir Alister was already dead before 11:30, and that Miss Lorne, delivering her correspondence at 1/4 that hour, was very probably the last living soul, save his murderer, to see him alive. Then the clock was stopped, Watson, altered by some careful hand, and set going again at an hour calculated to move suspicion away from whoever had cause to be abroad in that earlier, truer interval, and toward whoever could least easily account for the later one. It is a very old device, dressed in a very modern ruthlessness, and I confess I begin to see, though I do not yet see whole, the shape of the hand that set it turning. He said no more that evening, though I observed him sit long at the window, watching the last grey light fail over the wet lawns of Vane Court, his face grave with the particular stillness of a man who has very nearly, but not quite, completed the pattern he has been so patiently assembling. Chapter 9. The Record That Was Never Burned. Holmes asked that the household be gathered in the drawing-room that evening, a request Bradstreet granted with evident reluctance, for he regarded his case against Julian as complete, and plainly considered the whole proceeding a needless indulgence of my friend's love of theatre. Yet he came, as did Lady Eleanor, Clara and Captain Vale, Edmund Hale, Miss Lorne, and Stroud himself, who took a chair somewhat apart from the others, near the cold hearth, and sat through what followed with a stillness I did not, until it was very nearly too late, properly understand. "I have asked you here," Holmes began, standing before the fire with his hands clasped behind him in that attitude I had come to associate with the final unfolding of his reasoning, "because I believe an innocent man now lies in the county jail for a crime he didn't commit, and because the true circumstances of Sir Alister's death are considerably stranger than the sealed room in which he was found. He turned first to the matter of the locks. We have been told from the first that the record room could be entered only by the joint use of 2 keys, one held by Sir Alister, the other by Mr. Stroud, and that both were accounted for upon the morning of the murder. This is true, and yet it conceals a simpler fact. Mr. Stroud visited Sir Alister in this house upon the evening before the murder, ostensibly to confirm the arrangements for the following morning's meeting. During that visit, conducted privately in the study, he exchanged his own key for a duplicate prepared beforehand and left the inner door of the record room unlocked, though its outward appearance to any casual glance remained undisturbed. Stroud's face in the lamplight had gone the colour of ash, but he said nothing, and Holmes continued. There remained still the difficulty of entering the study itself, watched as it was by a footman in the passage from 7:30 that evening. But the study was not the only means of approach. The record room, as I discovered upon a closer examination of the library shelving than any of us had thought to make, communicates by a second way. A concealed document hatch, built into the old muniment cupboard, through which the family solicitors were once accustomed to pass deeds directly between the 2 rooms without troubling the household with their comings and goings. It has been hidden behind shelving these many years, and forgotten, I think, by every soul in this house save one who had cause, in the way of his profession, to remember it. "Stroud," said Bradstreet, in a voice suddenly sharp with attention. "Mr. Stroud entered the record room by that hatch, I believe, a little after 11:15, immediately after Miss Lorne had delivered the last of the evening's correspondence and withdrawn. He found Sir Alister alone, and confronted him, I think, not as a solicitor attending his client, but as a man begging for his own preservation. He implored Sir Alister to abandon his intended disclosure, to let the old falsification stand, and to spare the name of Stroud, father and son alike, the ruin that proof of a forged parish register must inevitably bring upon it. Sir Alister refused him. He believed, as I have said, that the restoration of Edmund Hale's true name was a debt of honour that could not, in conscience, be left unpaid. "It is a lie," said Stroud, but his voice carried no conviction, and no one in that room, I think, believed him, least of all himself. "Sir Alister refused him," Holmes repeated, and in the panic of that refusal, Mr. Stroud struck him down with the paperweight that stood upon the desk. Having done so, he did not flee, as a less methodical man might have done. He went instead into the record room, removed the genuine portfolio from its cabinet, and burned in its place a modern copy he had prepared some days before, in anticipation, I think, of precisely such a confrontation. The red wax we found upon the paperweight's base, and within the false envelope addressed to himself, came from the sealing of that empty letter, a device intended to suggest that Sir Alister had continued at his correspondence well after Julian's departure, and so shift the hour of death safely past midnight. He turned then to the clock, and to the altered memorandum of the morning's ride, both of which he laid, in a few brief sentences, at the same careful door. The clock was stopped, set back, and started again at an hour calculated to place the death within a window during which Julian, and not Mr. Stroud, could least easily account for his movements. The cuff-link, taken earlier from the billiard-room, where Julian had been at play some days before, was placed beneath the cabinet to complete the picture. And the forged fragment, found so conveniently among the ashes upon a second examination, was introduced, I believe, during the few minutes Mr. Stroud was permitted alone in that room this very afternoon, upon the pretext of assisting the inspector's inquiries. Bradstreet, to his credit, did not waste breath in protest, but demanded at once where the genuine record was now to be found. It was Holmes who answered, drawing from beneath his coat the leather dispatch case Stroud had carried with him upon every visit to Vane Court since our arrival. I remarked, upon Mr. Stroud's departure from this house 2 days ago, and his return this morning, that his case sat rather more heavily in his hand upon his going than it had done at his coming. A small matter, Watson will tell you, but small matters have served me well before now. He set the case upon the table and drew from its base, after a moment's careful search, a false bottom of thin, well-fitted leather, beneath which lay, folded and undamaged, the true Lien record, its parchment thick and browned with genuine age. The document, when Holmes read it aloud, proved to bear out every particular of his reasoning. Thomas Hale, it declared, had accepted the sum charged against Greyfield Farm not as an ordinary creditor lending against interest, but as guardian to a child then unborn, Frederick Vane's unacknowledged son, the lien serving as security for that child's maintenance and future protection, to be discharged only upon proof formally established of the young man's parentage. Stroud did not confess at once. It was only when Holmes, turning the burned fragment once more beneath the lamp, pointed out that the false document reproduced a legal abbreviation not introduced into common conveyancing practice, until some years after the genuine lien had been drawn, a small, dry point of professional usage that no forger, however careful, had thought to guard against, that the solicitor's composure broke at last, and he told us in a voice scarcely above a whisper the whole miserable truth of that night's work. "I did not kill him for gain, Mr. Holmes," said he when he had done. "I killed him to preserve a name, my father's name and my own, and the trust of 30 years' honest service that a single sheet of forged parchment would have destroyed in an afternoon. I have asked myself every hour since whether the name was worth the life it cost, and I have found, God help me, no answer that lets me sleep." Chapter 10. A Different Inheritance. Mr. Percival Stroud was taken into custody that same night, and went, I am told, without resistance, as though the effort of concealment had cost him more in the end than the surrender of it. Julian was released within the day, and I confess I have rarely seen a man so thoroughly chastened by an experience that had, after all, ended in his favour. He came to Holmes before our departure, and thanked him with a gravity I had not thought him capable of, adding, with a rueful honesty that did him more credit than his earlier bravado had done, that he had learned a hard lesson in how readily a man's debts might dress him, in the eyes of the world, in the likeness of a murderer. The genuine lien record was preserved, as Sir Alister had always intended it should be, and its consequences, when the whole matter came at last to be settled, proved gentler than any of us, I think, had dared to hope. Edmund Hale offered the opportunity to displace Julian and claim a considerable portion of the estate through the public proof of his true parentage, declined it absolutely. "I have no wish to build a fortune upon another man's disgrace, nor upon the scandal such a claim would surely bring down upon this house," he told Holmes, when we spoke with him for the last time in the State Office that had been, for 25 years, the whole compass of his ambition. "I will accept what Sir Alister meant honestly to give me, recognition of my true father, and the charge of Greyfield Farm, which I have tended these many years already, and love, I think, better than any man who might have inherited it by birth alone. I want no more than that." Lady Eleanor, whom I had thought, upon our first acquaintance, the coldest and most guarded soul in that whole troubled household, surprised me more than any other by the change I witnessed in her before we left Vane Court. She called upon Holmes herself, on our last morning there, to say that she had resolved to abandon the household's long policy of silence, and to receive Edmund Hale hereafter, not as a steward set apart, but as a relation acknowledged before the whole county. "I have spent 20 years, Mr. Holmes, believing that dignity was a wall to be maintained against the world," said she. "I begin to think now that a dignity founded upon concealment is merely fear wearing formal clothes, and that a family strong enough to own its truths need build no such wall at all." Clara's marriage to Captain Vale proceeded without further obstacle, the question of her son's legitimacy having been settled, in the course of Holmes's inquiries, rather more securely than her fears had allowed her to hope. And Julian, sobered by his ordeal, accepted a smaller portion of the estate than he had once expected, together with an arrangement of his own proposing that placed the management of his own affairs under terms considerably stricter than any his uncle had ever imposed upon him. Miss Lorne remained at Vane Court as Lady Eleanor's secretary and companion, her quiet watchfulness, I think, rather more valued now than it had ever been before. The rigid hierarchy I had observed upon our first evening in that house was, by slow degrees, entirely altered. When Holmes and I dined there once more some weeks later, at Lady Eleanor's particular invitation, I found Edmund Hale seated at the family table as a matter of course, not as master of the house, nor as its dependent, but simply as what he had always been in truth, though none had until now acknowledged it, a vein among the veins, bound to that name by blood rather than by service. It was upon the journey back to London, as the train carried us at last away from Surrey through a countryside washed clean by the recent rains, that I found occasion to remark upon the singular character of the case we had just concluded. "It is curious, Holmes," said I, "how thoroughly the appearance of greed explained every clue we found, and yet how entirely it missed the truth that lay beneath them all. I confess that I, for one, was very nearly persuaded, upon the evidence of the cuff-link and the note alone, that Julian's guilt required no further proof. Greed is a convenient theory, Watson, precisely because it may be calculated," Holmes replied, watching the fields slide past the window with that air of contained satisfaction he wore only after a case had been brought to its proper close. "A man's desire for money admits of measurement. So many pounds owed, so many pounds to be gained by a given act, and the mind, being naturally economical, reaches for it first, as the simplest explanation that will account for the greatest number of facts. But pride and shame and the preservation of a name a man believes to be sacred are a good deal more dangerous than greed, Watson, precisely because they cannot be so measured, and because those who serve them are generally convinced in their own hearts that they defend something nobler than mere self-interest. Stroud did not kill for a fortune. He killed to preserve an illusion, the illusion that his father, and therefore he himself, had served this family with an honesty that had, in fact, been compromised 26 years before either of us was called to Surrey. I sat a while in silence, turning the case over in my own mind, before I ventured the reflection that had been forming in me through the whole of that quiet journey. "It is a strange inheritance that Sir Alister has left behind him, Holmes. He set out to settle a debt of law, and instead uncovered a debt of conscience that has remade the whole character of his house." "That is very well put, Watson, and truer, I think, than you perhaps intend it," said Holmes, closing his eyes at last against the fading light. "The Lien record was drawn 26 years ago to bind a piece of property. It has taken rather longer than that to reveal the invisible obligations that bound an entire family, obligations of truth and courage, and the plain duty owed by the living to a wrong long buried but never truly discharged. Sir Alister Vane died believing himself a man of rigid principle, and I think upon the whole, Watson, that the world may allow him that much, whatever else it withholds. He set a debt right at the last, though it cost him his life to do it, and there are worse epitaphs, my dear fellow, for a harder man than he. The train carried us on through the gathering dusk toward London, and I thought, as I've thought many times since, that of all the strange inheritances that had passed through Vane Court in that troubled autumn, it was perhaps this one, the hard, clear lesson that truth, however long delayed, exacts its payment in the end, which Sir Alister, without ever intending it, had left most enduringly to those who survived him.